Wow.
Okay, so I guess this is a cue to start. Good afternoon. Welcome to all of you. My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my greatest pleasure to welcome you to the session focused on space industry, space security, and multilateral efforts in space security. We have a wonderful panel. This is the event organized jointly with the EU External Action Service. And we're very honored to have here Marjolijn van Deelen, who is the EU Envoy for Space Security. And we will dive into the discussion. Without further ado, you have the names of our speakers. We had actually a replacement, and we now have Morgane joining us from Astroscale. But to leave more time for our speakers, we want to really start with the efforts looking into multilateral efforts to focus on space security and preventing conflict in space, particularly with the Paris process. The process is over 40 years now. It has some successful, but we're not there yet in terms of having an international agreement on these issues. Nonetheless, we also observe many changes, obviously, in past 40 years. First, the technological changes and capabilities. Secondly, the emergence of commercial space industry and operations that is, to a certain degree, has a huge presence and dominating the current developments in space. But we also see the blurring of the lines between commercial, civilian operations and military operations, defense capabilities. This morning you've heard a lot about the space security and defense. And what we want to explore in our discussion is really how the national, regional efforts in pursuing space security, commercial use of space, and defense use of space is aligned with the international efforts to prevent the violence in space and space security. So we'll start with you, Marjolijn, and then we'll ask you to focus on the EU efforts and engagement in Paris process and other priorities for EU. Marjolijn.
All right. Thank you very much, Elena, and a big thank you to VCDNP for organizing this session. It's an innovative setup. I like it that we're in a circle, so I'm hoping for good participation from the audience. Just to very briefly emphasize what you said, indeed we have international law applicable to outer space. International humanitarian law is also applicable to outer space. And of course, as cornerstone, we have the Outer Space Treaty. So we have things, but it's very limited, and it's especially outdated given the very different use that we make now of space than when the Outer Space Treaty was drafted in the 60s. We have a lot more actors in space, very different actors, not only state actors. We have many new technologies. The Outer Space Treaty only looks at weapons of mass destruction, for example. Right now there's many other threats out there in space. So we do see that there is a really clear need to build new rules for outer space, because the framework that we have traditionally is not enough. Now, you mentioned PAROS, which is a UN process going on for years and years, preventing an arms race in outer space. which tries to set up a new legal instrument. It's being driven mostly by Russia and China. And their focus for this new treaty that they've already made a draft of is really about limiting placing weapons in outer space. But then again, what is a weapon? Is a satellite that is used to push another satellite out of orbit, is that a weapon? Or is it entirely civilian use? Are rendezvous and proximity operations without prior notification, are those a weapon or not? So for the Western group, that doesn't really work. So we have embarked on a discussion on to try and identify what norms, rules, and principles we need in outer space in order to to increase our security, but also to avoid any escalation. I mentioned the example of rendezvous and proximity operations without notification. There is a real risk that if a satellite from an adversary comes too close to one of ours, that we might have a response that is rather strong, and that may be unintended. Right now, we don't have a system where we have a phone number to call. So we're in this process of building these norms and rules. We hear a lot from especially the military, how much they are looking for these norms and rules in outer space that would help frame their activities, compare them a bit to rules of engagement. Because to them that helps give this predictability. We don't hear that much from industry, even though industry also designs to operate in space, provides to operators. So that's why this discussion is really timely, that we can also engage with both the military and the industry, together with the policymakers and the diplomats, on how to best take this discussion forward. Now, this is a UN discussion, so it's not fast, and maybe we should be fast. We try to be as fast as we can, but of course we can count on a few countries to always try and obstruct our processes. What we do as EU so far, we've participated in the working groups in the UN that have been discussing this issue. There's a new one that has started last year, where we actually combine both our norms and normative approach, as well as a potential legal approach, or an approach to come to a treaty. That had a difficult procedural start before we could all agree on how we would do that and how we would discuss both. But we've now finally started. Already for the first meeting as EU, we wrote a working paper about threats, where we characterize what we see as threats in outer space. And that's not only cyber and counter space and the more kinetic threats, but that also includes this behavior of which I just mentioned a few examples. We did that, and we also set out in a working paper how we see this developing as a set of norms that could eventually be adopted at the UN, but that could also be adaptive in time as technology keeps advancing, as space gets more congested, other actors, we may need more norms. So we could develop those, as well as eventually, lock them down in legally binding instruments. But for us, that's at the end of the road rather than the start of the road. So those documents are public documents. Everyone can look them up. They're on the UN website, but we're also happy to pass them on or to give you the link if that's useful. What we also, what we want to do for this next stage, the coming year, is to look more together with our defense communities and our industries, how we can have this integrated approach. Because we know our defense industry is heavily investing in space. So how does that, what kind of norms do they need to be able to operate predictably? What kind of notification systems? And the same with the industrial side. What are the threats that they see, that they are confronted with? What types of norms would they want to see in space? So this is the work for the coming year that we're going to embark on with the 27 member states. That also doesn't make it a snappy process, but it does make it a solid process. And I think that's important. Now, this whole line of work was in our strategy for space security and defense that came out 2 years ago, which is still very valid, and which also sets out how we look at threats as EU, how we respond to threats, how we make sure our defense communities can benefit from space services, and how we make our space program resilient. And of course, we do all that with our partners. So we've really doubled down on partnerships, working closely with a lot more countries around the world, both the like-minded ones. We were in Norway on Friday, discussed this issue with them as well, but also with the UN. We have a big project with UNIDIR, and I'd really would encourage you to look at their website. They have a very good space security portal. And to work with them to also engage others outside of our own group, of the Global South, of industry, of scientists, of think tanks, to help us build this approach. So actually our partnerships are strengthening our work on this. And I mentioned these 5 pillars because we also see all of those pillars strengthening each other. The multilateral approach would strengthen our approach on increasing defense use for military use.
Thank you, Marjolijn. Much appreciated. Moving now to Louis Reitmann, a research fellow at the VCDNP, who had been leading a project research and capacity building dialogue efforts on space security and responsible behavior in space particularly. But I also wanted to ask him about his research on how defense actors and space industry can support space security. Louis?
For sure. Thank you, Elena. And thanks very much to Marjolijn for getting us up to speed on the discussions in Geneva. As you said, Elena, at the VCDNP, we are working with the UK Foreign Office on helping governments to agree on norms and standards that aim to preserve strategic stability and prevent conflict in space. And as part of that, we're creating a new resource called the Space Norms Atlas, which will be the first mapping of emerging norms for space security coming out in March. For this project, we've collected over 1,200 data points from 13 years of UN processes, so it's quite a lot of relatively boring documents to go through. But the good news coming out of this research is that governments have come up with a wealth of norms that can help to regulate behavior in space. And these norms spell out good behaviors that reduce tensions, such as communicating with each other when there's a conjunction risk, but they also identify irresponsible behavior that we don't want to see, like blinding or dazzling optical sensors. However, I think that there's a growing realization among states that holding out for consensus among all states on norms in space is not sustainable, especially because Russia and China continue to be obstructive. Space is becoming crowded and fast, and many countries are developing counter-space capabilities. So without taking action to manage the geopolitical tensions that transcend from Earth into space, the resulting risk just becomes unacceptably high. And that's why I believe in the next few years we will see like-minded countries working to adopt standards and practices to increase transparency and predictability in space. And I think that in developing these standards, industry input plays a critical role. And I just want to dwell on this point a little bit because we have industry in the room, which is really not a given for the UN processes in Geneva. So first, obviously, more than 90% of the objects in space are commercial. So naturally, commercial operations in space shape what's considered normal. What is the baseline? What is the standard? And some in industry have very much understood their own importance in making the rules of space. Confers, for example, is an industry group that has developed guidelines for safe RPOs, and that's one of the main security challenges that is being discussed in Geneva. Second, in space, the lines between governments and industry are blurry. Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty that Marjolijn mentioned says that governments are responsible for the activities of their space industries. So norms of behavior in space will shape not only state, but also commercial activities, from the capabilities that are designed into satellites, to launch procedures, to operations, to how defense capabilities can be used. Many of the norms that are discussed in Geneva directly relate to commercial operations. They're about avoiding debris creation, communicating with other operators, and so on. And the distinction between governments and industry is even weaker when we talk about commercial capabilities for defense, because space industry will be directly involved in tensions with adversaries. Just to name one example, there is an idea in industry to deploy commercial bodyguard satellites around allied military satellites to protect against intelligence gathering from Russian and Chinese satellites. So there will quite literally be a commercial asset between two military assets. And then the third reason is that the operator's perspective is extremely useful for developing actionable norms of behavior. Because the delegates in Geneva discuss these norms at a very abstract level with not a lot of the technical and operational detail that somebody actually operating a satellite would be looking for instructions. So we need to bring industry experts in. Last September we did just that. We convened government officials with industry to work on measures that can help reduce the security risk posed by RPOs. Given their potential dual use. And because we had industry there, the measures we came up with were more focused and they were more effective than what we tend to see coming out of the UN processes. And that is the really tangible value of having industry at the table. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Louis. And since we indeed focus on your presentation more on the engagement of the industry, I'm so delighted we have representatives from the industry on our panel today. And Brian, you are a seasoned expert in space commerce and policy. What are the top trends in space tech and industry that are changing the threat landscape in space?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really good question because as you laid out in the beginning, Paros has been around for 40 years plus. For much of that, Paros was talking about many of the same issues. It seemed like not much had changed, but in the last 5 years, quite a lot has changed, I would say. One of the biggest, and this was hinted at earlier, is that the concept of a proliferated constellation of satellites went from a PowerPoint idea to reality. Starlink has more than 10,000 satellites on orbit. We now see multiple other companies in the US, in Europe, in China, deploying their own large constellations. And that has had significant implications for things like deterrence. One of the reasons you'd have a large constellation is so that attacks on individual satellites are pointless. If you destroy a satellite, it does not matter. We have 10,000 more. That is something that was theoretical 5 years ago and is now reality. As was mentioned, there's also multiple companies from multiple countries that are doing activities on orbit that used to be only done by governments and only a couple of governments. Things like rendezvous, proximity operations, on-orbit inspections, taking photographs of other satellites. And what's different is that is being posted on social media. Again, this was not even dreamt of 5 or 10 years ago, and now is the reality, and it's moving so quickly. I'm not sure how many governments actually have really understood what big of a change that is. Related to that, there's this notion that every satellite is now a sensor. Not only are we able to collect space situation awareness information from traditional telescopes and radars located on the ground, but every satellite has star trackers on it that help it know where its position is in space. Those star trackers are looking at everything else around them, and there's projects underway to make use of all that data. So now we no longer have to worry about data from, let's say, a few dozen or a couple hundred telescopes on Earth. We now have 10,000 telescopes in space just from Starlink, and every other satellite is going to have those as well. So there's a wealth of new data coming along. We're also seeing more autonomy on satellites and space objects. Those 10,000 Starlink satellites performed around 300,000 autonomous maneuvers last year for both reducing the risk of collisions, but also maintaining their orbital constellation and maintaining their altitude. That is 1,000 times more than was done just 5 years ago across pretty much all the satellites. They're autonomous, it's not AI, that's a whole different discussion, but it's the start of satellites starting to do more things based on their own processing instead of only reliant on commands from humans on the ground. And that's going to change even more as we have what's called edge compute moving into space. So satellites traditionally have been what we call dumb pipes or bent pipes, where we send a signal up to a satellite, it gets reflected back to the ground, or the satellite collects information and transmits to the ground. And there's not much done on the satellite itself. Now, satellites are starting to incorporate more computing on the satellites, such that, for example, an imagery satellite in the near future might take a photograph, look at the photograph, determine that something of interest is there, and task another satellite to take a follow-up photograph or some other type of event. That is starting to happen, and again, is a very big change. And then I'll just say, on top of this, we have seen commercial and government satellites being, space capabilities being used and being attacked as part of armed conflicts. Starting from the Syrian civil war, through what's happening in Ukraine, through the war in Gaza, and even with the protests in Iran, there are widespread attacks on space systems, not the satellites themselves necessarily. And it's primarily electronic warfare and cyber attacks. So we're seeing real world examples that we did not have as much in the past. And again, I think all of this is very important to help inform and shape what's happening in Geneva and elsewhere.
Thank you, Brian. And now, Morgane, to you. Astroscale is pioneering in-orbit servicing solutions, and you work with governments on norms and regulations that aim to prevent incidents in space. Could you say us a little bit more about that engagement and why it's important to the commercial sector?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be with you on the panel, and you've opened the door for industry to speak multiple times, so I will try my best to give you an operator's perspective, but also an in-orbit servicing provider perspective, which means we are the one doing these new maneuvers, approaching very close to a spacecraft, maybe docking eventually, taking pictures. So first, I wanted to say two things before diving into regulation. The first one is for us and for every other satellite, but especially for us, given the nature of the maneuver we do, orbital safety is the reason that we will be able to open our market and to have commercial service. We really need this, and we need the norms associated to this, and we need also the clarity that the maneuvers we are doing are not misinterpreted. I think you all hinted to, we approach this might be a conflict. So that's why for us the norms are also really important, and to not have commercially or geopolitically problems and conflict when we do our operations. I think the second thing, and you were hinted to the change in the last 5 years, I would say even in the last 2 years. So we were founded for our mission on space sustainability and orbital sustainability, and we have 2 missions already in space and other in preparation. Since the last 2 years, we also have multiple missions with defense government in each of our entity, in the US, in Japan, in the UK, in France. And that's really new. We didn't add this before, and we expect that more than half of our revenue in the near term will be coming from defense capacity. So it's a reality that, yes, we are in between government satellites and other assets, and that we have missions. It's also innovation. We have a mission in Japan that's just been announced to build some robotic capability for the MOD. We have a US mission on refueling military assets with the US Air Force. So that's a reality, that's already contract happening, and we're working also in France with our local MOD. That being said, one of our core missions since the beginning is to build the technology. We need to do this stuff, is to have a business case, to have a commercial client and institutional client. But also one of our core pillars from the beginning was to inform policy and work hand in hand with government to actually perform our mission. And a story I like to tell is when we launched our first mission and we started to do it, so before launching, we needed a license. So a mission to demonstrate docking, magnetic docking. No one wanted to give us a license. That was a Japanese mission, 2017. Our CEO went to, I think, 10, 12 countries. And in the end, the UK, so the UK regulator was in advance and gave us a license for this mission. We see now 10 years after, it's not even a question. All of our governments, France, Japan, we see Luxembourg mission give us a license for this mission, for this docking mission, for operating. But it's still a very long process that these licenses, that the spectrum, that the requirements are really adapted and tailored to our operational needs. So that's why we give the feedback. We had many examples where we did this. We did this with the UN first, where speaking on the debris mitigation guidelines, our CEO always come to the corpus. We work with these teams. But I think what's important for operators, for the industry, is that these UN guidelines, they actually flow down to national regulations, because that's what's really impacting us, at least on the short term. We need how are we building our satellite specifications against space debris, and we need to follow these rules. How are we getting the license and the license for in-orbit servicing? How are we getting spectrum for in-orbit servicing? That's another work we've done a lot with the ITU through Confers, which Astroscale also was a founding member, and one of our CEO was the president of Confers for the first few years that you mentioned. We developed, we helped in the ITU, for instance, the last regulation addressing sustainability, to maybe propose an agenda item on in-orbit servicing spectrum. So we don't think of all the operational things we need to think of in terms of regulation, but this is very important that we have the right one to do secure activities. So yeah, that's a bit of the reality of operators. And in the end, like the norms and the regulations, we aim to be transparent with the regulator. So in our mission last year, 2 years ago, it goes really fast, we inspect really close to space debris. So we come close to 15 meters. That was a world first. Obviously, we were really transparent with our regulators in showing this, and we want to move from demo mission like this to services, and the norms are really helping us to do this.
Thank you, Morgane. This is very helpful, and the time is running out quickly, but we do have a little bit of time. I'm going to ask a second question to our speakers and ask them to limit it to 1 minute or so. But there will be a next event after us, so we'll probably hold off questions from the audience. But our speakers agreed to hang around, and you can ask questions after the panel. But in the meantime, Marjolijn, how can industry support your work at the UN, and what would be helpful?
I think especially events like this really help to have an informal exchange and for industry to maybe get a sense of what it is we're working at, how that affects them. So sorry to hear. I would have loved to have questions from the audience to have an exchange, but maybe we can do that next time, and also open to discuss with anyone who's here. We can also think of doing a side event in the context of one of the UN meetings with industry. It's then the question is then always which industry, who do you invite? You can only get so many on a panel, so we'll need to find a way to streamline that. But very happy to hear about the work that Louis has been doing in engaging with industry and coming up with already with actionable norms. And I'd like to understand more about those.
Thank you, Marjolijn. And Louis, you've been making a case about the need to better connect industry, space defense and multilateral space security. What actions can we take in this domain?
So I think there's many things that we can do to connect the dots, as the event is called. Starting small, we can make sure that the delegates in Geneva understand how new tech and new missions actually change the space domain by bringing innovators to Geneva. Brian listed a number of developments that are really crucial to the discussions in the UN. And I'm not sure that all of them are well or, frankly, at all understood by the diplomats in Geneva, who are very busy with a very crowded disarmament agenda. But that's all the more reason, as Marjolijn has said, that governments and industry can partner up to organize side events, presentations, briefings at these UN meetings. Most countries support this idea, and we've actually done it before in the open-ended working group that met in 2022-2023. Before each of the sessions, there was an expert briefing specifically tailored to that session. And we had Astroscale, we had ExoAnalytic, we had Eutelsat providing these briefings. And many delegates in Geneva still talk about how useful that was to make the discussions more productive and results-oriented. I mentioned other things before, bringing industry experts to the table to develop those national measures, as Morgane also highlighted, for space security, making sure that the UN guidelines flow down to the national level. But I also want to give a great European example for connecting industry, space defense, and space security. And I think that that's the EU-SST partnership, because it's a place where governments and industry collaborate towards comprehensive regional SSA capabilities. Public funding obviously helps industry build more of the observation hardware, and that additional data that's generated then benefits both public and private operators. And it enables European space defense not only by giving us better eyes on the skies, but also by harmonizing how SSA data in Europe is collected and shared. And the final piece, the space security part, is that it also helps us monitor behavior in space. It helps us to spot violations of norms for space security. So I think that this is really a great model that other regions of the world can look to for inspiration. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Louis. And Brian, now to you. When you think of good industry practices in transparency and risk reduction in space, what comes to mind?
Yeah, well, I want to highlight something that was mentioned earlier, and that's the work of some of the trade associations, and particularly confers, in developing industry practices and standards. And I was involved in the creation of it, and I'm still involved today. But that has been really helpful in industry saying this is how we are going to be operating, and trying to distinguish between an activity being done in a commercial context and something that is being done in a national security military context. I think that, you know, the more we can do to clarify the distinction between those kinds of activities and how you can identify one or the other is very helpful. Because, you know, as was mentioned, there is a lot more government interest in procuring commercial capabilities for military use. That is going to make this more difficult going forward. So the more we can do to distinguish and clarify, I think that's the real ideal.
Awesome. And last question comes to you, Morgane. Can you share an example how your collaboration with government has helped make space more secure? In 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds. I'll take the example of my colleague from the UK. They worked on with the UK government on something called the UK Sandbox, so really a tool. And so they used a simulation of an end-of-life mission in low Earth orbit to simulate all of the steps of the legal and regulation requirement they were going to do and adapt the regulation to do this. They've done this in LEO. It was really successful with a few actors in the UK, adapt the regulations. Now they want to do in GEO, and hopefully we can do this in other governments also and apply this in reality.
Thank you. I really would love to continue the discussion, but I'm so delighted that we had at least a multi-stakeholder discussion of this issue and highlighted the need to really engage different actors in space security discussion. And I would really love for you to join me in thanking our panelists for joining us today, and please stick around if you have questions.